My stepson told the tribunal I was too confused to manage my pension or the ranch I bought after military service. Then I saw the beneficiary form he claimed I had signed in 1998. The unit printed beneath my name did not exist until 2005. I kept my face still and asked the clerk for the original.
I appreciate you settling in with me for this one.
Before we begin, do me a small favor. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever trusted someone with everything, only to discover they were working against you? Yes or no? I read every single one. A few details in this story have been shaped for storytelling purposes. The message at its core is what I hope stays with you. My stepson told the tribunal I was too confused to manage my own pension, and his wife didn't even bother to look at me when she nodded along. I shuffled into that hearing room at the Billings Federal Building on a Tuesday morning in late June, wore a faded canvas jacket that Jolene had pulled from the back of my closet the week before. It was the same jacket I'd worn to my wife's funeral 18 months ago. Jolene knew that. She picked it because it hung off my shoulders now, because it made me look like a man who had stopped caring about the fit of things. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed against pale institutional walls, and the air conditioning pushed the smell of old carpet and fresh printer toner across the room in waves that nobody else seemed to notice. I noticed everything. My name is Harvey Redman. I am 71 years old. I spent 28 years as a pararescue helicopter pilot in the United States Air Force, and I have pulled wounded soldiers out of places that don't appear on any map you've ever seen. But on that Tuesday, I sat in a cold metal chair with my hands folded in my lap and let every person in that room believe I was a confused old man who couldn't find his own mailbox. Garrett Redman, 45, my adopted stepson since the age of 7, sat at the petitioner's table in pressed khakis and a blue blazer. He looked every inch the dutiful son forced into a painful decision. His wife, Jolene Redman, 42, sat beside him with a tissue folded precisely in her lap and the kind of concern on her face that never quite reached her eyes. They had rehearsed this. The posture, the grief, the reluctant sighs. I recognized the choreography because I had spent 3 decades reading body language in combat zones where a wrong read meant a body bag. Their attorney stood and addressed Judge Constance Thornton, a 61-year-old VA administrative law judge with reading glasses on a silver chain who studied the petition with the careful patience of a woman who had read thousands. Your Honor, Mr. Redman's cognitive decline has been documented by 2 independent specialists, the attorney said. He poses a risk to himself and to the management of substantial federal benefits. Garrett leaned toward the attorney. Just make it quick, he murmured. He doesn't even know where he is. Jolene placed her hand on Garrett's arm. Stop fidgeting, she whispered. Let the lawyer work. If you've ever sat in a room where everyone has already decided you don't matter, you know exactly the temperature of that silence. It's not cold, it's not hot. It's the absence of temperature altogether. The kind of nothing that tells you they've already written the ending and you're just the body in the chair they need to point at. I let my hands tremble. Not much. Just enough for the judge to see. The attorney produced a beneficiary designation form, allegedly signed by me in 1998, and began walking the judge through the transfer provisions. He spoke about my declining capacity, my inability to manage financial decisions, and the urgent need for guardianship over my VA pension and the ranch outside Billings that had been in my family for 3 generations. I watched the document on the overhead screen, the way a man watches a bird he can't quite identify, head tilted, eyes narrowed, mouth slightly open. Performance. Every bit of it. But then I read the fine print. Beneath my name, in a block the attorney had not bothered to reference, was a military unit designation. The 438th Special Operations Support. The form was dated 1998. 1998. The form said 1998, but the unit printed beneath my name did not draw its first breath until 2005. 7 years. Someone had forged a document using a unit that wouldn't exist for another 7 years. And they hadn't even checked the Air Force order of battle before they did it. I knew because I had served under that unit's predecessor, the 212th Rescue Squadron, for the final decade of my career. I knew the activation date the way I knew my own birthday. I kept my face still. I kept my hands in my lap, and I raised my voice just enough to carry. "Ma'am," I said, letting the word come out thin and uncertain. "Could I see the original of that form? My eyes aren't what they used to be." Judge Thornton nodded. "Clerk, please provide the original to the respondent." The clerk reached for the filing cabinet behind her. Garrett's attorney glanced sideways at his client for the first time, and I saw something pass across my stepson's face that I hadn't seen in 32 years of raising him. A flicker of doubt about whether he truly knew the man sitting across from him. But I need to back up, because that moment in the tribunal, the clerk reaching for the cabinet, my stepson's jaw tightening by a fraction only a pilot would catch, that didn't happen overnight. Let me tell you how I ended up in that chair. Until 6 weeks before that hearing, I believed the hardest thing a man could survive was burying the woman who made his life worth living. My wife, Eleanor, died of a stroke 18 months earlier, on a Sunday afternoon in November, while I was checking fence line in the north pasture. By the time I got back to the house, the coffee she'd poured was still warm on the counter. She was not. 28 years of para-rescue had taught me how to read a room before I ever stepped into one. I flew 11 combat extractions. I pulled wounded soldiers out of landing zones where the ground was on fire and the radio was nothing but screaming. I retired at 47 with a full pension and a body that mostly still worked and a mind that worked entirely. Eleanor and I settled on a 160-acre ranch outside Billings, Montana, land my father had bought in 1961, and we raised cattle and hay and a boy who was not mine by blood but became mine by every measure that matters. Garrett was 7 when I married Eleanor. He had her eyes, and his biological father's restlessness, and no memory of the man who'd left before the boy could walk. I adopted him. I taught him to ride, to fish, to fix a carburetor, to shake hands like he meant it. I never once introduced him as my stepson. He was my son. For 32 years, that was enough. I trusted him so completely that I had stopped checking on anything at all. And that trust was the door I left wide open. After Eleanor passed, the silence in that house was the kind that has weight. It pressed on the walls. It sat in her chair. I started losing some hearing, age not injury, and got fitted for AIDS at the VA clinic in Laurel. The world got a little quieter, and I let it. I handed Garrett the mailbox key, the appointment calendar, and the VA paperwork. I told myself 32 years of raising a boy had earned me that trust. I told myself a man who taught his son to write his own name could trust that son with the rest. I was wrong about that. But I wouldn't know it until a postal carrier made a mistake. On a Tuesday afternoon in early May, I walked down the gravel drive to the mailbox with meadowlarks calling from the north pasture and the smell of sage and cattle dust riding a warm Montana breeze. The box was stuffed with seed catalogs and a water bill and one manila envelope that didn't belong. It was addressed to Garrett's dealership office on Grand Avenue in Billings. The carrier had put it in my box by accident. Same last name, same rural route, different delivery point. I almost set it aside, almost drove it into town the next morning. But the return address was the Department of Veterans Affairs, and it was addressed to my son, and something in my chest went cold before my brain caught up. I opened it standing at the mailbox with the sun on my shoulders and the wind bending the grass flat. One wrong mailbox. That was the entire margin between me and losing everything I had spent a lifetime building. The envelope held a carbon copy of a petition Garrett had filed with the VA, requesting fiduciary appointment over my pension, $7,400 a month, citing what he called observable signs of cognitive decline. There was a cover sheet with handwritten notes in his writing. There was a checklist of behaviors he claimed to have witnessed. There was a paragraph suggesting I could no longer manage financial decisions regarding the ranch or my federal benefits. I read it 3 times. The first time to understand the words. The second time to believe them. The third time to make sure I wasn't the confused old man he said I was.
I wasn't.
The petition was typed, printed, signed, and mailed to the government that had paid me for 28 years of service. My own son had described me as a man who couldn't be trusted with his own life. And he'd done it behind my back, through official channels with the kind of quiet paperwork that moves through systems without making a sound until the locks change. My hands were trembling when I folded that letter back into its envelope. But not from confusion, not from age, not from fear. They were trembling because I recognized the handwriting on the cover sheet. I had taught that boy to write his name at this very kitchen table, and now he had used it to sign away mine. I put that envelope back together, walked inside, set it on the kitchen table next to the coffee I'd forgotten to drink, and did not call my son. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not the day after that. I waited 3 days before I said a word, and every one of those days I spent watching Garrett the way I used to watch a landing zone before I committed the aircraft. You circle. You observe the wind, the terrain, the things that move and the things that should be moving but aren't. You don't land until you understand what's waiting for you on the ground. On Saturday, he came for his regular visit. I heard the diesel engine before I saw the truck Garrett always drove too fast on the gravel, kicking dust into the cottonwoods like the road owed him something. I was sitting in my father's chair on the porch with the petition folded in my jacket pocket and a cup of coffee that had gone cold in my hand. He came up the steps 2 at a time the way he always did, grinning, talking before he'd even cleared the top step. Something about a truck he'd taken in on trade at the dealership. Something about a fishing trip he wanted to plan for July. Normal, easy, the rhythm of a man with nothing to hide. I let him finish. Then I pulled the petition from my pocket and held it out. What is this? Garrett. He barely glanced at it. That was the first tell. A man seeing a document for the first time picks it up. He reads it. He turns it over. Garrett looked at the top corner, recognized the form number, and slid it back across the railing like it was a grocery receipt. "Dad, relax," he said. "It's just paperwork. You hate dealing with the VA. I'm trying to make your life easier. That's literally all this is. This form says I have cognitive decline. Garrett, those are your words on a federal document. It's a checkbox. Dad." He leaned against the porch post and crossed his arms relaxed, the posture of a man explaining something simple to someone slow. They make you check something or they won't process it. You know how government forms are. A lie from someone you raised sounds exactly like the truth, except it arrives too quickly and leaves no room for you to speak. His delivery was smooth, rehearsed. He had the cadence of a man who had practiced this conversation in the mirror or in the car on the way over, hitting every beat with the precision of someone who knows the script but has never lived the scene. He smiled at the right moments. He shook his head at the right pauses. He even laughed a short, warm laugh that said, "Come on, Dad," without the words. I've sat across from hundreds of people in military debriefs, survivors pulled from wreckage, soldiers pulled from behind enemy lines, pilots who lost aircraft and needed to explain why. In 28 years of flying rescue, I learned one thing about human beings under pressure. The ones telling the truth always ask questions back. They want to know what you know. They want to fill in the gaps. They lean forward. The ones hiding something only give answers. They lean back, they explain, they cover the ground before you can dig in it. Garrett leaned back. He explained everything: the form, the checkbox, the VA process, the convenience of having a family member handle appointments. He covered it all with the easy confidence of a man selling a truck to a customer who doesn't know what's under the hood. But he never asked the one question an innocent man would ask first. A guilty man doesn't ask questions because questions are doors, and he already knows what's behind every one of them. He never said, "How did you get that?" He never said, "Who showed you?" He never said, "Where did this come from?" He just smiled and explained and patted the railing twice on his way down the steps and told me he'd call Tuesday. I sat on that porch until the sun dropped behind the beartooths and the temperature fell hard enough to see my breath. The meadowlarks had gone quiet. The diesel smell from his truck still hung in the sage. The petition sat on the railing where he'd pushed it, corners lifting in the evening wind. He never asked how I knew. In 32 years, that was the first conversation with my son where he forgot to be curious. And it was the last conversation where I forgot to be careful. That silence on the porch stayed with me for 2 days. I replayed the conversation the way I used to replay cockpit recordings after a mission, listening not for what was said, but for what was missing. By Tuesday evening, I had my answer. But Garrett didn't come Tuesday. Jolene did. She came alone, which meant this wasn't a visit. It was an operation. She let herself in through the side door without knocking, something she'd never done while Eleanor was alive, and found me in the living room reading a seed catalog I wasn't actually reading. She sat down across from me with her hands folded in her lap, manicured nails pressed together. And that particular softness in her voice that women use when they've already decided you're broken and just need you to agree. "Harvey, I'm not saying this to hurt you," she began, "but you missed Dr. Evers last Thursday. You just didn't show up. And Saturday. Ray Cofield saw you standing at the end of the county road looking like you didn't know which way was home." I set the catalog down. "I canceled that appointment myself. Jolene called the office Wednesday afternoon." She tilted her head. The tilt was precise, rehearsed sympathy, calibrated to a fraction of a degree. "See, that's what worries us. You don't remember canceling, or you remember something that didn't happen. Either way, Harvey, it's the same problem." She was describing my own life back to me and getting every detail wrong on purpose. That's not confusion, that's construction. She was building a case the same way a contractor builds a wall, one fabricated brick at a time, mortared with just enough sorrow to sound selfless. I knew I had canceled that eye appointment because I wrote it in the pocket notebook I've carried since flight school, Wednesday, May 8th. Called Evers' office, rescheduled to June. And I hadn't set foot on the county road that Saturday because I'd spent the entire day replacing a waterline coupling in the barn. The security camera on the north gate would show my truck parked in the same spot for 9 hours straight. But I didn't say any of that. I nodded slowly, the way a confused man nods when the world is moving too fast. I let her believe the bricks were landing. She stayed another 20 minutes, touching my arm twice, calling me Dad 3 times, and leaving behind the faint trail of her perfume and a sense of satisfaction she didn't bother to hide as she pulled the door shut. I locked the door behind her and stood in the silence of the living room, listening to the house. The bird song through the kitchen window sounded muffled, the way it had for weeks now. I had blamed it on age, on grief, on the quiet that filled a house after the person who made it loud was gone. But standing there with Jolene's perfume still hanging in the air and her lies still ringing in my ears, something shifted. I went to the kitchen, picked up my phone, and opened the Bluetooth control app for my hearing aid. The app was simple. I'd set it up at the VA clinic months ago with a password so I could adjust volume and clarity settings from my phone. I rarely touched it. The audiologist had calibrated it, and I'd left it alone because the settings worked. Except they hadn't been working, not for weeks. I tapped the adjustment history log and the screen filled with entries, 14 adjustments in 21 days, each one reducing volume by 2 or 3 decibels. Each one trimming clarity frequencies by small, almost imperceptible margins. Each one timed to the day before a family visit. 14 adjustments. 21 days. Not one of them mine. I scrolled through the timestamps. The first change was April 28th, 3 days after I'd handed Garrett the mailbox key and the VA paperwork. The most recent was yesterday. The pattern was surgical. Lower the volume just enough that I'd miss words in conversation, trim the clarity just enough that I'd ask people to repeat themselves, grade the device so slowly that I'd blame my own ears instead of the machine. And I had. I had blamed myself every single time. Every muffled conversation, every moment I'd leaned forward and said, "What was that?" Every instant, I'd wondered if the world was getting quieter or if I was getting older, all of it manufactured, all of it deliberate. The app required a password. I had set that password at the VA clinic and shared it with exactly one person, the day I asked him to help manage my medical appointments. I stared at that screen until the coffee beside me went cold. 14 times, someone had reached into my ear and turned the world down, and I had blamed myself every single time. The password belonged to the same man who told the government I was losing my mind. I closed the hearing aid app and set the phone face down on the kitchen counter. The evidence was clear now. The petition, the fabricated incidents, the sabotage device. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a campaign. And I was still sitting in my own kitchen, trying to decide what to do about it, when someone knocked on the door. The knock was so soft, I almost missed it. When I opened the kitchen door, my granddaughter was standing on the step with her backpack still on, and her eyes full of something no 13-year-old should have to carry. Wren Redmond was small for her age, with Eleanor's sharp chin and a habit of twisting her backpack straps when she was nervous. She was twisting them now, both fists wrapped tight in the nylon, glancing over her shoulder toward the county road like she expected headlights any second. "Grandpa," she whispered, "can I come in?" I stepped aside. She slipped past me into the kitchen, and the night air followed her in sage and cold dirt and the faint smell of wood smoke from the morning stove. The clock above the sink ticked loud enough to fill the silence between us. "Dad's been printing stuff late at night," she said. "Lots of pages. He puts them in that brown case and takes it to the truck before Mom wakes up." "Has he said anything about what they are?" "No." She looked at the floor. "But Mom told me if anyone asks. I didn't see anything. That's how I knew something was wrong." She was 13 years old, and she had just done something braver than most adults manage in a lifetime. She chose the truth over her own parents. She rode her bicycle 2 miles down a dark gravel road to tell her grandfather something she'd been told to forget. And she did it knowing that if a mother found out, the consequences would land on her, not on me. I didn't ask her to explain. I didn't push for details. I poured her a glass of milk, sat across the table, and let her tell me what she'd seen at her own pace. The locked office door after midnight, the printer running for 20, 30 minutes at a time. The leather briefcase Garrett kept under the driver's seat of his truck. Jolene's voice down the hall saying, "Keep your mouth shut about all of it," in the tone parents use when they've stopped pretending the rules are fair. Wren finished the milk, squeezed my forearm once with a hand so cold it startled me, and said she had to get back before her mother noticed. I watched her ride into the dark, the reflector on her rear wheel blinking smaller and smaller until the cottonwoods swallowed it. I locked the door. I turned off the kitchen light. I sat in the dark and did what I had done for 28 years before every mission that carried real risk. I cataloged the terrain. The petition, Jolene's fabricated incidents, the hearing aid sabotage log, now secret documents compiled at night and hidden in a briefcase, Jolene coaching their daughter to stay silent. Every piece pointed in the same direction, a coordinated operation designed to strip me of my autonomy before I understood what was happening. In the cockpit. The moment you stop fighting turbulence and start flying through it is the moment you take back control. You don't wrestle the yoke. You read the instruments, you trust the training, you let the air move around you until you find the line that takes you through clean. SEER training, survival, evasion, resistance, escape. The Air Force taught it to every combat pilot. The core principle was simple. The man who survives captivity is not the one who fights hardest, it's the one who controls what his captors believe about him. You give them the prisoner they expect. You stumble when they want you to stumble. You look confused when confusion serves you. And behind the performance, you build your escape one invisible piece at a time. They wanted a confused old man who couldn't remember his own road. Fine. I would give them exactly that. I would slow my speech. I would let my gaze wander. I would set things down and forget where I'd put them. I would become the man on Garrett's petition, and I would remember everything. I lay in the dark and rehearsed every detail. The slower cadence, the vacant look, the hands that would fumble with simple tasks. Tomorrow morning, I would begin disappearing into the man they needed me to be. The hardest part would not be the performance. The hardest part would be looking my granddaughter in the eye and letting her believe it too. The performance began the next morning with a misplaced coffee mug and a question I already knew the answer to. By the end of the first week, I had the rhythm down, the slight hesitations, the wandering gaze, the moments where I would stop mid-sentence and blink as though the words had simply left. But the real test came on Sunday, when I set the table for dinner and invited them all. I set 4 plates on the table that evening and called the mashed potatoes by my dead wife's name. And the look on Garrett's face told me the curtain had gone up. "Garrett, pass the what's-it-called, the Eleanor made this, didn't she?" I let my voice trail away. I stared at the empty chair at the end of the table where Eleanor had sat for 30 years. No, wait, she's not. I let the silence do the work. Garrett set his fork down and reached across the table to touch my wrist. "It's okay, Dad," he said. "You don't have to remember everything. That's what we're here for." The warmth in his voice was perfect. Practiced. The kind of compassion that arrives on cue because it was never real in the first place. Jolene leaned toward him behind her napkin. I caught the whisper the way I used to catch radio chatter through static. Not every word, but enough. "Write that down tonight. The name confusion. The doctors will want specifics." They were building a case file at my dinner table, being my pot roast, sitting in my chairs, and cataloging my performance like doctors charting symptoms on a ward round. The rosemary I'd rubbed into the meat filled the room and mixed with Jolene's perfume, and every bite I took was part of the act, chewing slowly. Set the fork down too carefully, picking it up again as if I'd forgotten I was holding it. The cruelest part of pretending to lose your mind is watching the people who are supposed to love you look relieved that it's happening. Garrett's shoulders relaxed after the third manufactured confusion. Jolene's whispers grew less cautious, her hand cupping his ear openly across the table because she no longer believed I could track a conversation at normal volume. They were settling in, getting comfortable. The declining old man was performing on schedule, and the timetable, whatever timetable they were running, was holding. I asked Garrett twice in 10 minutes whether he'd checked the fence line this week. He answered both times with the same patient smile. Jolene's eyes flicked to his, and I saw her mouth the word repetition behind her water glass. 4 fabricated symptoms in 90 minutes, each one noted, filed, and ready for a doctor who would never know they were staged. But there was one person at that table I could not fool. Wren sat across from me with her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. She hadn't spoken in 20 minutes. She watched me the way a child watches a parent who has come home different. Not frightened exactly, but searching. Measuring every word against the grandfather she knew 2 weeks ago. Her eyes kept narrowing, then widening, then narrowing again. As if she was running some internal calculation she couldn't quite solve. Wren stood in that hallway after dinner for a full minute, staring at me from the shadows, while I pretended to doze in my chair. Every cell in my body screamed to tell her the truth, to sit her down and explain that Grandpa was fine, that this was a plan, that I was still the man who taught her to saddle a horse. But the mission required her fear to be real, because if she stopped being afraid, they would notice. Children who stop worrying are children who have been reassured. And reassured children change their behavior. And changed behavior is a crack in the wall that people like Jolene know how to read. So I kept my eyes half closed and let her worry. It cost me more than any mission I'd ever flown. After their taillights disappeared down the gravel drive, I sat up straight and let my face go still. I cataloged the evening with military precision. 12 whispered instructions from Jolene to Garrett. 4 fabricated symptoms documented for the medical file. 1 granddaughter who almost broke my cover with nothing but the look in her eyes. And 1 last detail I was not supposed to catch. Just before Garrett had pulled on his coat and reached for the door, he murmured 2 words to Jolene quietly. Quickly. The way a man speaks when he thinks the old man in the chair is already asleep. Solar and deadline. I didn't know what they meant yet, but I knew they mattered, and I knew that whatever deadline he was running toward, it was the reason all of this was moving so fast. 2 words had been rattling inside my skull since Sunday night's solar and deadline, and I needed to hear them again. This time with enough context to understand what my son was building and how fast it was moving. So I set a trap made of pot roast and fatigue. I invited Garrett and Jolene for a midweek supper, kept the performance tight, repeating a story about a neighbor's fence I'd already told 10 minutes earlier. Setting the salt shaker on the wrong side of the table. Pausing mid-sentence to stare at the window as though something out there had stolen my thought. By 7:30, I announced I was exhausted and shuffled toward the bedroom with the careful, heavy gait of a man who has used up his last good hour. I did not go to bed. I went 6 steps past the bedroom door and pressed my back flat against the hallway wall, where the old farmhouse acoustics funnel kitchen voices straight down the corridor. My father built this house in 1961, and he built it with plaster walls and hardwood floors that carry sound like a church carries hymns. I stood in the dark in bare feet on cold wood and listened. They didn't wait long. The moment my bedroom door clicked shut, Garrett's whisper turned urgent. I could see his shadow pacing back and forth through the strip of kitchen light under the hallway door. The refrigerator hummed between his sentences like punctuation. They already wired the advance, Garrett said. 1.2 million. It's gone. Jolene, every cent went to keep the dealership doors open. If we don't get the signature authority before their deadline, they're going to come collecting, and they don't send lawyers first. 1.2 million. Already spent. Every cent poured into a failing car dealership while my hearing was being dismantled 1 decibel at a time. Jolene's voice came back sharp and low. Then we speed it up. The affidavits, the petition, all of it. We file emergency if we have to. He's not getting better. Garrett. Everyone can see that now. It's 160 acres of flat Montana pasture, Garrett said, and his voice shifted not softer but hungrier. The way a man sounds when he's rehearsed the numbers so many times, it's become a prayer. The solar people said it's worth $28 million over the lease term. We just need his name off the title and mine on it. I stood in that hallway and let the words settle into my chest like shrapnel. The supper grease hung in the air, mixing with the cold sage draft that came through the gap under the back door. My bare feet ached on the hardwood. My hands were flat against the plaster wall, and I could feel my own pulse through my fingertips. I had spent 28 years pulling people out of burning wreckage, and now I was standing in my own hallway listening to my son set fire to everything I'd built. The solar lease. That was the engine. That was the reason for the petition, the sabotaged hearing aid, the fabricated symptoms, Jolene's rehearsed visits, the midnight documents in the leather briefcase. All of it. Every whispered instruction. Every manipulated decibel, every patronizing smile across my dinner table was infrastructure. A machine built to strip my name from the deed so Garrett could sign a contract he had no right to sign, using land he had no claim to own. He had already taken an advance he couldn't return from people who would not accept an apology. The dealership was drowning. The money was gone. And the only way out was through me, through my land, my title, my legal authority, my mind. He needed me declared incompetent before a deadline I still didn't know, and every day that passed wound the spring tighter. I went back to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. The hearing aid sat on the nightstand, the device they had been corrupting for weeks, and for the first time, its silence felt like a gift. Because what I had just heard with my own damaged ears was worth more than anything that device had ever delivered. $28 million over the lease term. 160 acres of pasture my father had bought with cash from a cattle sale. A son who needed me erased from my own life before a clock ran out. I didn't know the deadline yet, I didn't know the name of the solar company or the terms of the advance or what happens when you owe people who don't send lawyers first. But I knew the shape of the thing now. I knew its weight and its speed and its direction. And I knew I could not fight it alone. I knew I couldn't fight it alone. But before I could find a lawyer, I needed proof that would hold up in a room full of people who didn't know me. The app log on my phone was a start. A professional diagnosis was a weapon. I left the ranch before sunrise, in the one vehicle on the property that didn't have GPS, a 1997 Ford with a cracked windshield and 200,000 honest miles on it. The odometer. I took Route 312 east toward Laurel, 40 miles through empty highway with the Beartooth foothills purple against the dawn. The old vinyl seats warmed under the morning sun, and the wind buffeted the cab at 60. And I drank gas station coffee that tasted like it had been brewed during the previous administration. I chose Laurel because nobody there knew my name. I chose a small audiology clinic on the main street because it was the kind of place that took walk-ins and didn't ask for insurance cards up front. I paid cash. I gave only my first name. And I handed the young woman behind the diagnostic bench my hearing aid and told her I was worried about battery performance. Dr. Faye Holbrook was maybe 35, with steady hands and a no-nonsense manner that reminded me of the flight surgeons I'd known in the service. The kind of professional who pulls a device apart on her bench without asking unnecessary questions until the data tells her which questions matter. She connected the hearing aid to her system, tapped through 3 screens, and went quiet. I had driven 40 miles just to ask a stranger to confirm something I already knew in my bones but needed someone else to say out loud. That silence in her office was the answer arriving. I watched the green diagnostic waveforms pulse across her monitor and waited for the words I already carried but couldn't speak for myself. "Mr. Redman," she said, turning the screen toward me, "this isn't a battery issue." She pointed to a column of timestamps running down the left side of the display. Each one corresponded to a remote adjustment made through the Bluetooth app. "Someone has been accessing your device remotely and reducing your settings in small increments," she said. 14 times in 21 days. "Your prescription calls for 62 decibels. Right now, this device is set to 41. That's not drift, that's deliberate. 62 decibels down to 41. That is not aging. That is someone slowly erasing you." She scrolled through the log, pointing out the pattern, each reduction timed 2 or 3 days apart. Each one shaving just enough that the change would feel like natural decline rather than mechanical interference. The clinical beep of her equipment punctuated the silence between her observations, and the antiseptic air of the office felt suddenly like a different kind of examination room, not medical, but forensic. "The increments are too consistent to be accidental," she continued. "Whoever did this understood the app interface and knew how to make the changes small enough that you'd adapt rather than notice. This is," she paused, choosing her words, "this could be classified as tampering with a medical device. You should be talking to law enforcement, not just an audiologist." "Can you print that?" I asked. "The log, the settings, all of it." "I can." She was already reaching for the printer. "But I need you to understand what I'm looking at. This pattern didn't happen by accident." Someone with access to your account did this intentionally, and they did it over a period of weeks. If you know who has your app credentials, you need to act on that. I knew. I had known since the moment I first opened that app in my kitchen, but knowing and proving are different countries. And I had just been handed my passport. She printed 4 pages, the full diagnostic report, the adjustment timeline, the prescription comparison, and a summary stating that the device had been modified well below therapeutic levels through unauthorized remote access. I folded the pages into my jacket pocket and thanked her. She watched me walk out with the expression of someone who understood she had just handed a quiet old man a loaded weapon. I sat in the truck in the parking lot with the engine off and the printout warm against my chest. The proof was real now, documented. Signed by a licensed professional who had no connection to my family and no reason to lie. The audiologist had told me to call the police, but I wasn't ready for police. Police meant reports and interviews and a process that would alert Garrett before I was ready. I needed something the police couldn't give me. A lawyer who would understand what it means to have your own family forge documents against a veteran. And I knew exactly where to find one. I turned the truck east toward Hardin. 45 miles on a road I hadn't driven in years. With a diagnostic printout in my jacket and a name I'd pulled from the Veterans Network, a lawyer who specialized in elder law for military families. I didn't know what I'd find. I just knew I needed someone who would understand the weight of what I was carrying without needing it translated. The office was on a side street off the main drag, a modest storefront with military commendations framed in the window, and a brass plaque that read, Sinclair Law, Veterans and Elder Advocacy. I pushed the door open and the highway noise dropped away behind me. The room smelled like old leather chairs and fresh coffee. And there was a ceramic mug on the desk with a Marine Corps emblem that told me this man had served before he'd practiced. Boyd Sinclair stood behind his desk. He was 46, broad-shouldered, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a shrapnel scar that disappeared beneath his collar. He looked up when I walked in, and his face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds: confusion, recognition, and something close to shock. His pen clattered onto the desk. "I know who you are," he said, and his voice cracked on the second word. "I have known your face for 27 years. You're the pilot. You're the one who came back for us when the second bird turned around." 27 years. That's how long a debt of life sits in a man's chest before the moment arrives to pay it back. In 1997, I flew a pararescue helicopter into an active combat zone and extracted 11 wounded soldiers from a hilltop that was being overrun. The second aircraft in our flight had taken fire and peeled off. I went in alone. Boyd Sinclair was the youngest man on that hill, 19 years old. A shrapnel wound in his shoulder, screaming grid coordinates into a radio that was barely working. "You were the kid in the back with the busted collarbone who wouldn't stop yelling coordinates," I said. "I was 19, Boyd said. He came around the desk slowly, the way a man approaches something he's been waiting for. "You told me to shut up and hold pressure on Corporal Webb's leg. I did both. He lived, I lived, because of you." He poured coffee without asking, strong and black, from the pot on the filing cabinet and handed it to me in a mug that matched his own. It was the first cup I'd accepted from anyone in weeks. How do you explain to a man you once carried off a burning hilltop that your own son is now the one trying to set fire to everything you built? You don't explain. You brief. I sat in the leather chair across from Boyd's desk and delivered the intelligence the way I'd delivered mission reports for 28 years, clear, sequential, without emotion. The misdirected petition, the fabricated decline incidents, the hearing aid diagnostic showing deliberate sabotage, the overheard conversation about the solar lease on my land, the advance already spent, the deadline closing in. Boyd listened without interrupting. He didn't take notes. He didn't nod. He sat perfectly still with his coffee untouched, and when I finished, The silence in that office was the silence of a man running calculations he already knows the answer to. "Harvey," he said, "what you're describing is a coordinated fiduciary takeover using forged VA documentation. That's not state level, that's federal. And if they've already taken an advance on a lease, they don't have authority to sign. There's wire fraud on top of it." "I need eyes inside my own house," I said, "and it has to be invisible. We'll get you cameras, subpoena authority, and a forensic accountant." He leaned forward. "But Harvey, you have to keep playing the part. The moment they know you're clear-headed, they'll accelerate everything, and we lose the window. Can you do that?" I looked at this man, this boy I'd pulled off a hill when he was 19, who had turned himself into a lawyer and built a practice defending veterans from the people who were supposed to protect them. And I told him I'd been performing confusion since before he'd passed the bar. He almost smiled. Then he opened a drawer, pulled out a legal pad, and wrote 2 words at the top: Redmond v. Redmond. I shook his hand before I left. His grip was firm, sustained, and slightly trembling. Not from weakness, but from the kind of recognition that lives in the body longer than it lives in the mind. 27 years ago, I had pulled a bleeding soldier off a hill that was trying to kill him. Now he was the only man standing between me and a son who was trying to bury me in paperwork. He told me to go home and keep acting confused. I told him I'd keep my face still. I'd been doing it my whole life. Boyd called me back into his office before I'd made it to the truck. He cleared his desk, laid out a fresh legal pad, and asked me one question that reframed everything I thought I understood about what my son was doing. "Harvey, do you understand that what your son is building is not a guardianship? It's a seizure." I sat back down. He walked me through it with the precision of a man who had spent decades pulling these schemes apart. The VA petition was the entry point once Garrett secured fiduciary status, the power of attorney activated automatically. That gave him signature authority over the ranch deed. He wouldn't need my permission, my awareness, or my consent. He would just need me declared incapable by a tribunal that trusted 2 fraudulent specialist reports and a stack of manufactured symptoms. "And the hearing aid," I said, "where does that fit?" "It fits perfectly." Boyd leaned forward with his pen tapping the legal pad. "Every time they turned your volume down before a family visit, they were manufacturing observable symptoms for a medical record they're building without your knowledge. You ask people to repeat themselves. You miss parts of conversations. You look confused at dinner. It's elegant, Harvey, and it's a felony. Let me tell you something about the word fiduciary. It comes from the Latin for trust. And there is no uglier crime than building a legal instrument out of a word that means the exact thing you're destroying." Boyd outlined what we needed: surveillance footage of Garrett accessing my documents or discussing the scheme inside my home. The original forged forms to establish the 7-year discrepancy I'd spotted at the tribunal. And a forensic financial trail connecting the solar lease advance to Garrett's dealership accounts. He had an investigator and a forensic accountant he trusted, both veterans, both discreet. "But Harvey," he said, and his voice dropped, "you have to keep playing the part. The moment they know you're clear-headed, they accelerate everything, and we lose the window. Can you hold it?" I told him I could hold it as long as it took. That night, Boyd's 2-man technical team arrived at the ranch after midnight with their headlights off. I met them at the north gate in the dark, and the cold Montana air carried pine from the foothills and the taste of Boyd's overbrewed coffee still sitting sharp on my tongue from hours earlier. I led them to my trail cam stations, 3 weathered boxes I'd mounted on fence posts and barn corners 3 years ago to track whatever coyotes were getting at the calves. The boxes were sun-bleached, screw holes rusted, coated in a layer of dust and cobwebs that no one would think twice about. They had been part of the ranch landscape longer than Jolene had been part of the family. The team worked fast and quiet. They popped the housings open with screwdrivers that felt cold as surgical instruments in the night air. Swapped the wildlife camera guts with encrypted digital units that fed live to a secure server in Boyd's office, and snapped the weathered covers back into place. The green power light blinked once inside each box and then went dark. From the outside, nothing had changed. Same boxes, same posts, same ranch. 3 years those cameras had watched for coyotes in the dark. Now they were watching for something that walked on 2 legs and called me Dad. Boyd coordinated by phone, his voice low and steady in my ear. The housings stay, the guts change. If anyone looks at those boxes, they see what they've always seen, trail cams watching for predators. I stood in the dark, holding a screwdriver and listening to boots crunch on frozen grass, and thought about what my father would say if he could see me turning his ranch into a surveillance operation against his own grandson. I think he would have understood. He was a man who believed that land was not just dirt. It was a promise you made to the people who came after you. And promises have to be defended. By 2 in the morning, the team was gone. I raked the gravel smooth where their tires had pressed it and walked the fence line, checking each camera housing one last time. Every box sat on its same post as though nothing had changed. But the ranch was no longer just my home. It was a trap with open eyes, and every room my son walked into from this moment forward would be recording. I went inside, locked the door, and sat in the dark kitchen listening to the silence. The cameras were live. Boyd was watching. The evidence we needed was a matter of time and patience, 2 things a rescue pilot learns to carry the way other men carry wallets. The only question was whether Garrett would come first or whether Jolene would show up unannounced before the night was over. Jolene didn't wait until morning. The motion sensor at the gate blinked twice in the dark, and my stomach dropped, headlights low and slow, crawling up the gravel at 2:10 in the morning. I was standing behind the barn. 1 trail cam housing was still open, wires exposed. Boyd's crew kneeling in the dirt with a flashlight they killed the instant I hissed. 90 seconds. That was what I had between the gate sensor and a vehicle reaching the house at that speed. I pointed the crew toward the tree line, and they moved without a word. Duffel bags, tools, flashlight, gone into the dark like smoke. Then I did the only thing a man can do when his cover is about to blow and his body is the only weapon he has left. I ran to the porch, ripped the hearing aid from my ear hard enough to leave a sting, and hurled it onto the gravel. When Jolene's SUV rolled to a stop and her door opened, she found me standing in my undershirt in the cold, barefoot, screaming. "There's something in it," I shouted. "Something buzzing. It won't stop. Get it out. Get it out." She froze for half a second. Then she shifted into the role she'd been rehearsing for weeks, the concerned daughter-in-law, calm and competent, managing the confused old man. "Harvey, stop. You're going to hurt yourself," she said, her voice dropping from sharp to soft in one breath. "Give it to me. I'll take it to the shop tomorrow. You're okay. You're just confused." 28 years of military discipline is what let me scream like a man losing his mind while my heart beat steady as a metronome. My voice cracked on evidence. My hands shook, my eyes darted, and behind it all, my breathing was controlled. My pulse was measured, and I was counting the seconds until Boyd's crew cleared the tree line with the evidence of what we'd been doing. Jolene picked my hearing aid off the gravel and slipped it into her coat pocket like a trophy. She guided me inside with a firm hand on my arm, sat me down in the kitchen, and spent 20 minutes asking me gentle questions about what I'd heard and when the buzzing started. I gave her rambling, contradictory answers. I called her by Eleanor's name once. She nodded, with the satisfied patience of a woman who had just received another data point for the file. Then she drove away. I watched her taillights disappear past the cottonwoods and stood in the kitchen doorway breathing the cold pine air until my hands stopped performing their tremor and went still on their own. Behind the barn, the last trail cam housing was still open. I walked out in the dark, snapped it shut myself, and raked the gravel where her tires had pressed it. By the time the sun came up, the ranch looked exactly as it always had. 3 weathered boxes on 3 fence posts, a confused old man inside a quiet house. Nothing to see. Days later. Boyd called me to Hardin. He had the VA records spread across his desk, the originals, pulled through subpoena channels that moved faster than I expected. He set one document in front of me and tapped the unit designation block with his pen. The form says you signed with the 438th Special Operations Support Squadron in 1998, Boyd said. That unit was not stood up until 2005. Your son forged a document and used a designation that didn't exist for another 7 years. He couldn't have known the activation date. But I do, because I served in the unit that preceded it, and so did you. 1998. The form said 1998. The unit didn't exist until 2005. You can forge a signature. You can hire doctors to explain away a man's hearing, but you cannot forge time. 7 years, I said. That's not a clerical error. No, Boyd said. That's a federal crime with a paper trail that leads straight to his desk. He set the printout down and looked at me the way a surgeon looks at a patient before delivering the news that changes everything. We had the hearing aid diagnostic. We had the cameras recording. And now we had a forged federal document with a 7-year anachronism that no attorney, no specialist, and no amount of Jolene's whispered coaching could explain away. My son had made one mistake, just one. He had used a unit designation without checking when it was born. And that single error, 7 years, printed on a piece of government paper, was now sitting in a federal evidence file with his name on it. He could explain away a lot of things, but he could not explain away time itself. I thought the forged document was the worst thing Boyd would show me that week. I was wrong by $14.5 million. Boyd had his forensic accountant's findings spread across the desk when I arrived. Spreadsheets, contract copies, bank transfer records. All of it fanned out in rows with red highlighted figures that pulsed under the fluorescent lights like warning signals on a cockpit panel. A distant train horn moaned from the Hardin rail yard as he walked me through what his investigator had pulled from corporate filings and county records. Your son signed a preliminary land lease agreement on your 160 acres 18 months ago, Boyd said. A solar energy consortium backed by a private investment fund. He took an advance payment and funneled every cent into keeping his dealership running. The fund is now demanding either a signed final lease or full repayment, including penalties. Garrett doesn't have the repayment. He has your ranch. I gripped the chair arms and listened while the numbers landed like ordnance. The advance was gone. The dealership had swallowed it whole: payroll, floor plan financing, lease payments on a building Garrett couldn't afford, and inventory he couldn't move. The fund's penalties had compounded the original amount into a debt that would crush a man with 10 times Garrett's resources. He leased my land without my signature, I said. He signed the preliminary as your authorized representative using a power of attorney that doesn't exist yet. Boyd slid a contract copy across the desk. That's why he needs the fiduciary appointment. It retroactively legitimizes the preliminary and gives him authority to sign the final. Without it, the whole thing collapses and the fund comes for him personally. $14.5 million. Say that number slowly and ask yourself what a desperate man with a family would do to make it disappear. I sat there looking at my own reflection in Boyd's dark office window, a 71-year-old man in a canvas jacket, reading documents that proved his son had sold in like inventory. The lease term valued the land at $28 million over its duration. Solar panels on 160 acres of flat Montana pasture, soaking up a sky that had been free since my father bought the dirt beneath it. Every dollar of that contract required one thing: my name off the deed and Garrett's name on it. Boyd's coffee sat cold beside the spreadsheets. The printer toner and legal paper smell mixed with something I couldn't name, the scent of a room where someone's life gets translated into columns and rows, based on the fund's deadline structure. Boyd continued. I estimate Garrett files emergency within the week. Once he does, the VA tribunal has 72 hours to schedule a formal hearing. That's our window. Every lie, every dimmed decibel, every rehearsed look of concern at my dinner table, all of it was scaffolding built around one door. And behind that door was a contract with my name on land I'd worked for over 2 decades. The petition was the key. The hearing aid sabotage was the evidence of decline. The fabricated symptoms were the medical file. The forged beneficiary form was the legal foundation. And underneath all of it, buried in corporate filings that Garrett never expected anyone to dig through, was a preliminary lease signed in my name by a man who did not have my authority and a debt owed to people who did not accept excuses. My mouth had gone dry somewhere around the 3rd spreadsheet. I couldn't taste anything. I couldn't feel anything except the arms of the chair and the weight of the numbers pressing against the inside of my skull. He didn't want to protect me from my own declining mind. He wanted to sell the sky above my land, and he needed me erased from the deed to do it. Then we stop waiting for him to move, I said. We make him move. Boyd looked up from the legal pad where he'd been writing. What are you thinking? I'm thinking about what happens when a man who owes $14.5 million finds out the collateral is about to disappear. If I threaten to take the land off the table entirely, donate it, preserve it, lock it into something he can't touch, he'll have to accelerate. He'll file the emergency petition, and when he does, he walks into your window. Boyd set his pen down. You want to bait him. I want to give him the panic he needs to make a mistake he can't take back. I drove home that afternoon with the numbers still burning behind my eyes. Tomorrow I would pick up the phone and offer my son the one thing guaranteed to make a desperate man move too fast. The news that everything he'd built his scheme to steal was about to be given away. I dialed my son's number at 9:15 the next morning with hands that didn't shake at all. And that was the difference between this call and everyone before it. This time, I was the one in control. The coffee was still hot beside me on the kitchen counter. The morning light came through the window clean and golden, the kind of light that makes a Montana ranch look like a painting of someone else's perfect life. I held the phone against my ear and waited for him to pick up. 2 rings. 3. Then Garrett's voice cautious, with the sound of the dealership floor behind him. Dad, everything okay? I used the voice I'd been rehearsing, fragile but clear. The way a man with declining cognition sounds on a good morning. A voice that says the lights are on but the windows are fogging. Son, I'm having a good morning, clear as a bell. And I've been thinking. I paused the way a man pauses when he's pulling a thought together from a long way off. Your mother loved this land more than anything. I talked to a lawyer yesterday about putting all 160 acres into a conservation easement in her name. Permanent. He says we can sign by next Friday. The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds. I counted. Then Garrett's voice came back with the pitch shifted half a register higher and the words arriving too fast. Dad, slow down. You can't just... That's a huge decision. You need to talk to us first. You need to think about this when you're feeling more... And behind him, faint but unmistakable over the speakerphone, I heard Jolene's inhale, sharp, fast. The kind of breath a person takes when the floor drops out from under them. Hang up, she whispered. Hang up now. The line went dead. Setting a trap for someone you love means sitting afterward in a silence that is the loneliest sound a parent will ever hear. I set the phone down on the counter next to the coffee and stared at the wall and listened to the clock tick and the meadowlarks outside the window and the sound of absolutely nothing happening because the bait was in the water now and everything that came next would be Garrett's choice. There was no lawyer, there was no conservation paperwork. There was only a phone call designed to create the exact panic that would push a desperate man past the point of careful planning into the territory of irreversible mistakes. I didn't have to wait long. That night, lying in bed with Boyd's secure tablet propped on my chest, I watched the trail cam feed from my study go live at 11:47 p.m. The timestamp glowed white in the corner of the screen. Garrett's truck pulled up the drive without headlights. The north gate sensor pinged. Then the side door opened, and my son walked into my study with a phone flashlight in one hand and Jolene 2 steps behind him. They went straight for the filing cabinet. I watched through the grainy, green-tinted footage as Garrett pulled open drawers, rifled through folders, shoved aside papers looking for anything related to a conservation easement that didn't exist. Jolene held her phone up, scanning files with the camera. They worked fast and careless, the way people work when panic has replaced planning. Then Garrett stopped. He slammed a drawer shut and turned to Jolene with the desk lamp catching his face full. "If he signs that easement, the land is locked forever," he said. "The solar deal dies. The fund calls the loan, and we lose everything. Everything, Jolene." "Then we file emergency," she said. "Tomorrow. No more waiting." I played it back 3 times. Not because I doubted the footage, because I needed a moment to grieve the boy I raised before I moved forward against the man he'd become. The first time I watched for the evidence, faces, words, timestamp. The second time I watched his hands and noticed he paused at the family photo on my desk, the one from Yellowstone, and his fingers lingered for half a second before he shoved it aside to reach the file behind it. The third time, I just watched his face and tried to find the 7-year-old who used to fall asleep in my lap during thunderstorms. I couldn't find him. I closed the tablet and set it face down on the nightstand. The cameras had given Boyd exactly what he needed. My son's face. My son's voice. My son's own words, recorded in my own study, admitting that everything collapses if I sign. He had said we lose everything, but the truth was simpler. He had already lost the only thing that mattered, and he didn't even know it yet. By morning, I was at Boyd's house in Hardin, sitting in his kitchen with the tablet on the table between us and 3 cups of coffee I hadn't touched. He watched the footage once without speaking. Then he pulled the tablet closer and watched it again. The second viewing was the one that mattered, because Boyd caught what I'd been too angry to hear clearly the first time through. He rewound to the moment Garrett slammed the filing cabinet drawer and turned to Jolene, and he turned the volume up until the tablet speaker crackled. "Listen," Boyd said. "Right there." Garrett's voice came through thin and compressed by the trail cam microphone. "He's not declining fast enough. We need to double the frequency on the aids." Double the frequency. Not maintain it, not continue what they'd been doing. Double it. The sabotage that had already dropped my hearing 21 decibels below prescription was about to be accelerated, not to disorient me, but to damage me. At that rate, the audiologist in Laurel had told me, prolonged exposure to miscalibrated frequencies could cause permanent auditory nerve degradation. My son wasn't just trying to make me look confused anymore. He was willing to take my hearing permanently if it meant getting to that signing deadline. Boyd set the tablet down. "That's not fraud anymore, Harvey. That's assault with a medical device. Federal prosecutors will have categories for this that haven't been tested in court yet." Have you ever watched someone you love become a stranger in real time? Not over years, but in the space of a single sentence caught on a 4-inch screen. I had watched that footage 4 times now. Each viewing stripped away another layer of the boy I'd raised until there was nothing left but the architecture of what he'd built to destroy me. But there was one detail I couldn't stop seeing. One moment the cameras had captured that Boyd hadn't noticed because he was listening to the words and not watching the hands. I took the tablet back and scrubbed to the 40-second mark. Garrett was moving through the study, yanking folders, scanning labels. And then he passed my desk and his hand brushed the framed photograph sitting next to the lamp. The one from Yellowstone, summer of 2006. The 2 of us sunburned and grinning with our arms around each other's necks. His fingers stopped. For half a second, maybe less, they rested on the glass. Then he shoved the frame aside to reach the file folder behind it. Half a second. That was what remained of 32 years. The third time I pressed play, I didn't watch Garrett at all. I watched the photograph. I watched it get touched and then pushed aside. And I thought about the day that picture was taken, how he'd caught a cutthroat trout the size of his forearm and screamed so loud a bull elk spooked 200 yards upriver. He was 17. I was the man he wanted to show every fish to. I was the man whose approval was the only currency that mattered. I wept in Boyd's kitchen at 4 in the morning, and Boyd had the decency to leave the room. He went to his office and came back with 3 portable encrypted drives. I saved the footage to each one without wiping my face, because some things you do through tears and some things you do after them. And I had learned a long time ago that the mission doesn't wait for you to finish grieving. Boyd locked the drives in his gun safe, a 600-pound Liberty with a combination only he and I knew. 3 copies, 3 locations of evidence that proved my son had broken into my home, confessed to the conspiracy on camera, and announced his intention to escalate the physical sabotage of my hearing. I poured the coffee down the sink, untouched. The kitchen clock read 4:47 a.m. Dawn was still an hour away. Somewhere in Billings. Jolene was already working her phone, I was certain of it. The trail cam footage had captured her whispering about out-of-state doctors and emergency affidavits. And Jolene was not a woman who wasted time between a decision and its execution. By sunrise, Garrett would have 2 fraudulent affidavits from specialists who had never examined me, purchased signatures on federal documents, bought with the same desperate money that had fueled every step of this conspiracy. And that same evening, in a kitchen I couldn't see and on a phone I didn't know about, my 13-year-old granddaughter would press record inside a cereal box and capture the one conversation her parents never meant anyone to hear. But I didn't know that yet. I only knew that the evidence was secured, the grief was real, and the war was no longer something I could fight from the shadows. It took only 2 phone calls to buy a man's freedom. Garrett made 2. One to Reno, one to Boise. Boy's investigator traced both wires within 72 hours of the money leaving Garrett's account. Boyd laid the affidavits side by side on his desk 6 days before the hearing. 2 documents from 2 different states, signed by 2 different specialists, Dr. Harlan Pruitt, a neurologist in Reno, and Dr. Marlene Vickers, a psychiatrist in Boise. Neither had ever met me. Neither had conducted an examination. Both had certified my severe cognitive decline in exchange for $8,500 apiece, wired from Garrett's dealership operating account. Look at paragraph 3, Boyd said, tapping the highlighted sections with his pen. Identical language, word for word. Same adjectives, same sentence structure, same clinical terminology. Your boy used a template and sent it to both of them. He didn't even bother changing the phrasing. $17,000. That's what my mind was worth on the open market, less than a used combine. More than a good quarter horse. My son had put a price tag on my sanity and bought it from 2 strangers who signed their names to a lie without once looking me in the eye. This is fraud on the court, Boyd said. Federal wire fraud, money crossed state lines for the purpose of fabricating evidence in a VA proceeding. He's not just risking the ranch anymore, Harvey. He's risking prison. I sat in that office with the stale coffee smell and the hum of the fluorescents, and I thought about what it takes for a man to reach across 2 time zones and purchase a document that says his own father can't remember his name. I thought about the $17,000 and tried to remember what Garrett's college tuition had cost me per semester. More than that. I had spent more teaching him to think than he had spent erasing the evidence that I still could. Boyd filed the wire fraud documentation with his evidence package and added it to the counter motion he was building. 2 more exhibits, 2 more nails. The case against Garrett was no longer a collection of suspicions, it was a wall. But the last brick came from somewhere I never expected. 4 days before the hearing. On a Tuesday evening, while I sat in Boyd's guest room staring at the ceiling and trying to remember the last time I'd eaten a full meal, my phone chimed. A text from Ren. No words, just an audio file, and a message that arrived 30 seconds later. Somewhere, a 13-year-old stops being a child and starts being a witness. Nobody decided that line for Ren. She decided it herself. I pressed play. The recording was rough, muffled at the edges, with the crinkle of packaging close to the microphone. She had hidden her phone inside a cereal box on the kitchen counter. In the background, I could hear dishes in the sink and the hiss of the faucet running. Then Jolene's voice cut through, sharp and low. He shouldn't hear any of this. If that old man finds out before Friday, we lose the hearing and the house. Then Garrett, and his voice was different from anything I'd heard on the trail cam footage, not strategic, not controlled, not performing. It cracked. It broke open in the middle of a sentence, the way a voice breaks when the man behind it has run out of justifications. I know this is wrong, he said. I know, but there's no way back now. Joe, we owe $14.5 million, and the only exit is through him. The recording ran another 40 seconds. Jolene snapping about affidavit deadlines, Garrett going quiet, a cabinet door closing, then the audio cut. The text that followed arrived at 12:03 a.m. Grandpa, I think I just did the right thing. I played the recording twice. The first time I listened to the words. The second time I listened to the silence between them, the gaps where my son stopped talking and my granddaughter held her breath behind a cereal box. Choose her grandfather over her parents in a kitchen that smelled like dish soap and the end of a family. I set the phone down and stared at the ceiling until dawn bled through Boyd's curtains. My mouth was dry. My hands were still. My granddaughter had just handed me the last piece of evidence I needed, and in doing so, she had chosen a side in a war no child should ever have to fight. By Monday, Garrett would file for emergency removal of my legal rights. He would walk into that courtroom with his purchased affidavits, his fabricated medical file, and his rehearsed grief. And he would not know, could not know, that every weapon he had built was already in my hands. The trail cam footage, the wire fraud records, the forged document with its 7-year ghost. And now, a 13-year-old girl's recording of the truth her parents thought they'd buried in the kitchen after dark. Garrett filed the emergency petition on Monday. By Wednesday morning, 3 sets of headlights crawled through the fog on my gravel road at 6:14 a.m. And I was already dressed, boots laced, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee I'd brewed an hour ago. I had known this was coming. Boyd had warned me the emergency order would move fast once the purchased affidavits hit the VA system. What I hadn't expected was the convoy of VA Protective Services van, Garrett's truck, and a Yellowstone County Sheriff's cruiser. All 3 rolling up my drive in formation like they were coming to collect a fugitive instead of a 71-year-old man drinking coffee on his own porch. The caseworker stepped out first. Dale Pemberton, mid-40s. Yellowstone County VA Protective Services. A square-built man with a clipboard and the careful expression of someone who does this job because he believes in it, not because he knows what's behind it. He walked up the porch steps and handed me a folded document. Mr. Redman, I'm required to inform you that this order is temporary and subject to a full hearing, he said. You have the right to legal counsel. I read every word. Slowly, deliberately. I let my eyes drift and refocus the way a confused man's eyes might. The paper was cold between my fingers. Imminent risk due to cognitive incapacity. That was the phrase. Signed by a judge who had relied on 2 affidavits from doctors who had never been in the same state as me. I understand every word, son, I said, keeping my voice thin. I flew medevac in conditions that would make this paperwork blush, but I'll come quietly. Garrett was out of his truck by then, walking fast toward Pemberton. He gets confused in the mornings, he said, too quickly. Don't let the lucid moments fool you. Let me tell you what it feels like to be escorted off land your family has worked for 63 years by a man who learned to ride a bike on that same gravel. It feels like your chest has been opened and the wind is blowing straight through. Before I tell you what Jolene whispered to me as they walked me off that porch, before I reveal the words she chose for the moment she believed I was finished, I need to ask, are you still with me? Comment whether you think Jolene said something cruel or something calculated, and tell me why in a few words. I want to know how you're reading her. Please note what follows contains some recreated details for narrative purposes. The message behind them is what matters. Pemberton guided me down the steps with a hand on my elbow, professional, not rough. The morning dew soaked through the alfalfa, and the diesel exhaust from the VA van mixed with the smell of wet grass. I took one last sip of coffee. Bitter, already cold. The last thing I would taste from my own kitchen for weeks. That's when Jolene stepped forward. She leaned close enough that her perfume cut through the diesel. Close enough that only I could hear, and she whispered 5 words into my ear. Don't fight it. Dad, we won. Be smart. She called me Dad. 4 years of Harvey, 4 years of keeping me at arm's length with my own first name, and she saved Dad for the moment she thought I couldn't fight back. She used the word like a key, turning it in a lock she believed she'd already closed. I looked past her. The barn where my father built the first stall in 1961 stood gray and steady against the fog. The fence posts with their trail cam boxes sat on the property line like sentries. The cottonwoods along the drive were beginning to blur as the van pulled forward. I climbed into the van without a word. The door slid shut with a hospital-clean click. The vinyl seat was cold against my back, and my hand rested in my jacket pocket, where the phone sat heavy and warm. Boyd's number on speed dial. Wren's recording saved in 3 places, and the encrypted backup codes for every piece of evidence that would end this. The van turned left onto Route 312, and the ranch disappeared behind the cottonwoods. In the side mirror, I could see Garrett on the porch, already on his phone, pacing the boards like a man who owned the place. They thought they had taken my freedom. They had no idea what I still carried. The phone in my pocket held everything Boyd needed: surveillance footage, fraud records, a forged document with a 7-year ghost, and a 13-year-old girl's voice saying the words that would bring it all down. Friday was 3 days away. The van delivered me to Yellowstone View Care Facility before noon. They gave me a room with a window facing the parking lot and a bed that smelled like bleach and someone else's sleep. I lay down, closed my eyes, and started counting. The ceiling had 47 acoustic tiles. I counted them twice on my first night, once to stay sane and once to stay sharp. The performance at the facility was the hardest stretch of the entire operation. Not because the staff were suspicious they weren't. They were kind, efficient, and completely convinced by the paperwork that had delivered me. The hard part was the loneliness pretending. I repeated questions to the nurses. I fumbled with my meal tray, letting the decaf slosh onto the plastic. I called the night shift attendant by the wrong name 3 times until she started speaking to me the way people speak to children, slowly, with exaggerated patience. Her smile carrying the particular sadness of someone who believes they're watching a man disappear. I wasn't disappearing, I was waiting. Between bed checks, when the hallway footsteps faded and the facility settled into its institutional hum of disinfectant and reheated chicken. I pulled the phone from under my blanket and opened the hearing aid Bluetooth app. The same app Garrett had used to steal my hearing 1 decibel at a time. The same tool they had weaponized to manufacture my decline. It had a low bandwidth text channel built into its diagnostic interface, designed for audiologists to send adjustment notes to patients. Nobody monitored it. Nobody thought to. In SEER school, they teach you that captivity is a performance. The prisoner who looks broken survives. The one who looks defiant gets broken for real. I had learned that lesson at 30, and I was living it at 71. tapping coded messages to Boyd on a screen hidden under a hospital blanket while a nurse checked my vitals every 4 hours. "Package complete," I typed. 3 drives, Ren audio, affidavit match confirmed, ready for Friday. Boyd's reply came back in 12 minutes. "Judge Thornton drew the case. Strict on elder fraud. We file counter motion at 8 a.m. Don't break character." I set the phone under the mattress and closed my eyes. A nurse opened the door, and I blinked up at her with the careful confusion of a man waking from a dream he can't quite place. "Excuse me, dear," I said. "Is this Tuesday or Wednesday? I keep mixing them up." She smiled with that sad patience and told me it was Wednesday. 2 days until Friday. 2 days until I stopped pretending. Across the state in Hardin, Boyd was building the weapon that would end this. The night before the hearing, he laid every piece of evidence across his desk in the order he planned to present it. The forged beneficiary form with its impossible unit date. The trail cam footage of Garrett's midnight confession. The wire fraud documentation on the purchased affidavits. The financial forensics tracing the spent advance and the debt behind it. Ren's kitchen recording. 6 exhibits, 6 detonations, timed and sequenced. What kind of world asks a 13-year-old girl to testify against her own parents? And what kind of girl volunteers before anyone asks? Ren arrived at Boyd's office at 9 that evening. She had ridden her bicycle in the dark again, the same way she'd come to my kitchen door weeks ago, with her backpack twisted in her fists. This time she carried a single sheet of lined notebook paper, folded twice, with careful handwriting that slanted slightly to the right. "Ren, you don't have to do this," Boyd told her. "The recordings alone will be enough." "He's my grandpa," she said. "He taught me to ride before my dad ever showed up. I want to say it myself." Boyd took the letter. He read it once. Then he set it on top of the evidence folder without a word. Because some things don't need a lawyer's commentary. He closed the folder at 11:42 p.m. 6 pieces of evidence and 1 handwritten letter from a girl who had decided that love and loyalty are not the same thing, and that when they pull in opposite directions, you choose the one that tells the truth. In 8 hours, Garrett would walk into Judge Thornton's courtroom expecting to finalize the removal of a confused old man's rights. He would walk in with his purchased affidavits and his rehearsed grief and the absolute certainty that the system he had built would hold. He would find instead a retired Air Force rescue pilot with perfect cognition. 6 pieces of evidence that would dismantle every lie he'd told. And a granddaughter ready to look her father in the eye and speak. I lay in the facility bed and stared at tile number 23. Tomorrow. I would stop being the confused old man. Tomorrow. I would stop counting ceiling tiles and start counting the seconds until my son understood what he had lost. I shuffled into the VA Benefits Tribunal at 9:03 a.m., where the cardigan Jolene had picked out 2 sizes too large. The sleeves hanging past my knuckles. The kind of thing you'd dress a man in if you wanted a judge to see a ghost. The facility aide walked me to the respondent's table and pulled out my chair like I might miss it. I sat down slowly, folded my hands in my lap, and let my eyes drift to the middle distance where nothing lived. The courtroom smelled like floor wax and fresh printer toner. Fluorescent lights hummed against pale federal walls. Boyd sat beside me with his leather briefcase on the floor and a yellow legal pad centered on the table. The pad was blank. He hadn't written a single word on it. He wouldn't. Across the aisle. Garrett sat at the petitioner's table in pressed khakis and a navy blazer, flanked by Jolene and a man I hadn't seen before. Russell Kavanaugh, mid-50s, silver temples. A Billings litigation attorney with the kind of courtroom polish that came from billing $400 an hour and never losing sleep over who was paying. Garrett had hired him to make the case that I was too broken to manage my own life, and from the way Kavanaugh arranged his exhibits with surgical precision, he believed every word of it. Judge Constance Thornton entered from chambers at 9:07. She was 61, small-framed, with reading glasses on a silver chain and the deliberate posture of a woman who had presided over thousands of benefits cases and could smell manufactured urgency from across the room. She settled into her chair, adjusted her glasses, and nodded for Kavanaugh to begin. He was good. I'll give him that. Your Honor, the evidence before the court is unambiguous, Kavanaugh said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man who had practiced this opening in his office mirror. 2 independent medical specialists, one in Reno, one in Boise, have provided sworn affidavits confirming that the respondent's cognitive capacity has deteriorated beyond the threshold for self-governance. If you've ever sat in a room and listened to someone build a version of you that doesn't exist, assembled from purchased signatures and edited footage and your own son's rehearsed tears, you know that silence isn't just difficult. It's the hardest weapon you'll ever hold. Kavanaugh played the video next. Edited clips from the house cameras Garrett had installed under the pretense of home security. Me stumbling in the kitchen that was the morning Jolene had moved the step stool to the wrong side of the counter. Me staring blankly at the mail because the hearing aid had been dialed to static and I couldn't read the return addresses through the noise. Me calling Wren by the wrong name, a performance I'd calibrated to the decibel, feeding them exactly the symptoms they needed to see. The gallery murmured. I heard Jolene's perfume before I heard her whisper that same floral sharpness that had filled my kitchen the night she'd told Garrett to hurry. From the petitioner's table, she dabbed her eyes with a tissue folded so precisely it might have been ironed. Then Garrett stood. This is the hardest thing I've ever done, he said. And his voice cracked on the word hardest with the exact timing I'd watched him practice on the trail cam footage 3 weeks ago. The same pause, the same downward glance, the same hand pressed flat against the table as if he needed it to hold him up. But I can't watch my father lose everything he built because we were too afraid to act. Judge Thornton nodded. That was the first one. She nodded again when Kavanaugh cited the property value, again when he read from the affidavits, again when he described my wandering episodes, walks I had taken deliberately at hours I chose, to feed the narrative while Boyd and I built the case that would end this. 6 nods. I counted every one. 6 times a judge looked at me with the kind of sympathy that buries men alive. Boyd's legal pad stayed blank. His pen hadn't moved. My mouth was dry. I hadn't had water since the facility, and the metallic taste of adrenaline sat on my tongue like a copper penny. The wooden armrest under my right hand was cool and smooth, and I pressed my thumb against it the way I used to press the cyclic grip in the cockpit. Steady hands. Steady breath. Let them finish building. Mr. Sinclair, Judge Thornton said, turning to Boyd. The court will hear the respondent's position. Does your client wish to make a statement? Boyd stood slowly. He buttoned his jacket with one hand, reached into the briefcase, and laid the evidence folder on the rail in front of him. He didn't open it. He looked across the aisle at Garrett and my son for the first time that morning, stopped smiling. Boyd hadn't even opened the folder yet when I decided that waiting was over. I straightened my back. I lifted my chin. And I spoke in the voice I'd used to call in medevac coordinates under fire, clear, level, and loud enough to stop every breath in the room. Your Honor, before my counsel presents, I'd like to address the court directly. The cardigan still hung off my shoulders. My hair was still uncombed from the facility. But my voice landed on that courtroom like a hammer on glass, and I watched the shatter happen in real time. Judge Thornton's pen stopped moving. Kavanaugh's half-rise from his chair froze at an angle that would have been comical if the stakes had been smaller. And Garrett. Garrett stared at me the way you'd stare at a coffin if the lid swung open. I placed both hands flat on the respondent's table. No tremor. Fingers spread the way they'd rested on the cyclic grip for 28 years. The wood was cool and solid under my palms, and I pressed into it the way I'd pressed into every cockpit panel before a hot extraction, not for courage, but for calibration. "I'd like to see the original of Exhibit C," I said. "The 1998 beneficiary designation form, specifically the unit designation printed in Block 14. Judge Thornton nodded to the clerk. The folder came across the bench. I didn't reach for it with shaking hands. I didn't squint. I picked it up, held it at arm's length in steady fingers, and read the block I'd memorized from the tablet screen weeks ago. Block 14 lists my assigned unit as the 438th Special Operations Support Squadron, I said. That unit was not activated until March 2005. I know this because I served under its predecessor, the 212th Rescue Squadron, from 1990 until my retirement. Whoever created this document did not consult the Air Force order of battle. The courtroom inhaled, all of it. One collective breath drawn through 40 sets of lungs and held there in the stale, wood-polished air where nobody had exhaled in 30 seconds. Garrett's mouth opened. No sound came out. For the first time in 45 years, my son had nothing to say to me. Kavanaugh stood halfway up his chair, scraping against the floor. "Your Honor, I, the petitioner, was assured this document was authentic. I need a moment to—" "You will have your moment, Mr. Kavanaugh," Judge Thornton said. And her voice had changed. The maternal sympathy that had carried her through 6 nods was gone, replaced by something colder and considerably more dangerous. "After the respondent finishes," I set the form down on the rail. "Your Honor, I am not cognitively impaired. I have not been cognitively impaired at any point during the period covered by this petition." The 2 affidavits submitted, one from a neurologist in Reno, one from a psychiatrist in Boise, were purchased by the petitioner's wife through wire transfer. My hearing aid was deliberately sabotaged through its manufacturer app to induce symptoms of confusion. And every episode of so-called decline cited in this petition was staged by me to gather the evidence my counsel is prepared to present. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I'd heard since the cockpit. Judge Thornton removed her reading glasses. She did it slowly, pulling them from her face with her left hand, folding the arms one at a time, and setting them on the bench beside her water glass with the precision of a woman who needed both hands free for what came next. She looked at me, and I watched recognition move across her face like weather crossing a ridge. "Harvey Redmond," she said. "Pararescue. The Kobar extraction, 97. She said my name like it meant something beyond the guardianship petition, not the confused old man in the oversized cardigan. But the name a pilot earns when he flies into a combat zone and carries people home. "Yes, ma'am," I said. 11 men out. My brother served with Staff Sergeant Weeks, one of your 11. She paused, and the iron in her voice softened by exactly 1 degree. He never stopped talking about the pilot who came back for them under fire when the first extraction was scrubbed. "Mr. Redmond, you have this court's full attention, and my personal assurance that this proceeding will be conducted with the rigor your service demands." I tasted copper, clean and sharp, the same adrenaline flavor I remembered from every mission launch. But this time it didn't taste like fear, it tasted like arrival. Judge Thornton set her glasses on the bench and folded her hands. "Mr. Redmond, the court grants you leave to present evidence on your own behalf. Mr. Sinclair may assist as counsel." She turned to Kavanaugh with a gaze that could have frozen the Yellowstone in July. "And Mr. Kavanaugh, I strongly suggest your client remain seated, because what I suspect is coming next will determine whether this remains a family matter or becomes a criminal referral." Garrett gripped the edge of the petitioner's table with both hands. His knuckles were white. Jolene's tissue had stopped moving. The double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open before Judge Thornton's warning had finished settling over the room. Boy walked in carrying a banker's box under each arm, his stride unhurried, his face carrying the calm of a man who had rehearsed this moment for 27 years without knowing it. He set both boxes on the respondent's table with a deliberate thud that echoed off the federal walls. The cardboard smelled like the copy shop, and the inside of his briefcase paper and purpose. He straightened his jacket, turned to the bench, and spoke. "Your Honor, my name is Boyd Sinclair. I am Mr. Redmond's counsel of record." He paused not for drama, but for precision. "I am also Corporal Boyd Sinclair, formerly of the 212th Rescue Squadron support element. On March 14, 1997, Captain Harvey Redmond flew a pararescue helicopter into a hot landing zone outside Khobar and extracted 11 soldiers under direct fire after the primary extraction was scrubbed. I was the 9th man on that bird." The courtroom didn't murmur this time. It went silent in a way that felt structural, as if the walls themselves had leaned in. Kavanaugh stood halfway up. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Counsel is inserting personal testimony into a guardianship proceeding." "Sit down, Mr. Kavanaugh," Judge Thornton said without looking at him. Boyd continued as if the objection had never left Kavanaugh's mouth. "I don't owe this man one life, Your Honor. I owe him everything that came after it. My law degree, my practice, my daughter's birth. Every morning I've had for 27 years that I would not have had if that helicopter hadn't come back for us. Every day since that extraction has been borrowed time, and I intend to repay a portion of it right now." I bit the inside of my cheek. The salt bloomed sharp and immediate. 27 years Boyd had carried that weight. And he chose to spend it not on sentiment, but on standing in a federal courtroom and dismantling the case my own son had built to bury me. That was the kind of man who walks out of a combat zone and remembers not just that he survived, but who made it possible. Boyd snapped the clasp on the first box. The sound was small and final, like a round being chambered. "Exhibit 1, he said, passing a document to the clerk. The 1998 beneficiary designation form filed with the VA, the same document the respondent just identified as containing a unit activated 7 years after its alleged signing date. This form is a forgery." He didn't wait for a reaction. He was already pulling the next sheet. Exhibit 2 wire transfer records obtained from First Federal Bank of Billings, documenting 2 payments, $8,500 each, sent by Jolene Redmond to Dr. Harlan Pruitt in Reno and Dr. Marlene Vickers in Boise. These are the 2 physicians whose affidavits the petitioner submitted as evidence of cognitive decline. Neither doctor conducted an in-person examination. Both were paid to sign. $17,000. That's what it costs to erase a man's mind on paper, less than I'd spent on Garrett's first year of college tuition. Less than the monthly interest on the debt he was drowning in. Less than nothing to people who had already decided that my life was currency. "Exhibit 3, Boyd said, and his voice hadn't risen by a single decibel. He didn't need volume. The facts were doing the work. Financial records showing the petitioner carries approximately $14.5 million in personal debt, secured against assets he does not own. The property in question, the Redmond Ranch, is valued at $9.2 million. Upon gaining guardianship, the petitioner would control a solar energy lease valued at $28 million over 30 years. The motive for this petition is not care. It is solvency." Judge Thornton's pen had stopped moving. She wasn't taking notes anymore. She was watching Garrett with the focused stillness of a woman who had moved past adjudication and into something closer to investigation. Her reading glasses sat untouched on the bench where she'd placed them minutes ago. Garrett stared at the table. Jolene's hand had found his forearm. But for the first time in every scene I'd watched, every whispered instruction, every rehearsed performance, she had nothing to say. Her mouth was a thin line. Her tissue sat forgotten in her lap. "Does your client wish to respond to any of these exhibits before I proceed?" Judge Thornton asked Kavanaugh. And the question carried the courtesy of a formality that expected no answer. Kavanaugh looked at Garrett. Garrett didn't look up. Boyd reached into the second box and lifted out a laptop. He set it on the rail and opened the screen. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to play surveillance footage recorded inside the respondent's home. The petitioner appears in it, so does his wife. And what they say on that recording will make every exhibit I've just presented look like a misunderstanding. Judge Thornton nodded once, and Boyd pressed play. The laptop screen flickered to life on the courtroom monitor. There was my son, green-tinted, midnight, rifling through my desk drawers like a burglar in his own childhood home. The trail cam had caught everything in that flat, unforgiving resolution that turns familiar faces into strangers. Jolene followed 3 steps behind with her phone flashlight cutting a white beam across the study walls, and the timestamp in the corner read 01:14 a.m., June 4th, 2024. Garrett pulled open the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, the one where I'd kept the ranch deed since my father put it in my hands. "Find the solar file," he said on the footage. And his voice came through the courtroom speakers with a clarity that made the real Garrett, the one sitting 15 feet from me at the petitioner's table, flinch as if he'd been slapped. "If he signs that conservation thing Friday, the debt comes due and we're done. All of it." I watched the monitor. I did not watch my son. Some things are easier to see in playback than in person. And one of them is the moment your child stops being the person you raised and becomes someone you have to survive. Boyd let the footage run. Garrett on screen pulled files, muttered numbers, slammed a drawer hard enough to rattle the trail cam mount. Then Jolene's voice. "Double the frequency on the aids. He needs to be worse by Thursday. Confused enough that Thornton doesn't ask questions." Boyd paused the video. He let the frame sit Jolene's face frozen mid-sentence, her mouth shaping the word that would have buried me, and held the silence for 5 full seconds. The courtroom's recirculated air felt heavier, thick with the smell of overheated electronics and something else. Something that had no name but tasted like iron and cold water on the back of my tongue. "Your Honor," Kavanaugh said, standing. His voice had lost every trace of the polished cadence he'd opened with. "I am withdrawing as counsel for the petitioner, effective immediately." He didn't say goodbye to his client. He closed his briefcase, the clasp snapping shut like a period at the end of a sentence, nodded once to the bench, and walked out of the courtroom. The door swung shut behind him with a soft pneumatic hiss, and Garrett sat alone at the petitioner's table for the first time. No attorney, no script, no rehearsed grief left to perform. Jolene's hand found Garrett's arm. He didn't move. "Mr. Sinclair," Judge Thornton said, "proceed." Boyd reached into the second box. "Your Honor, the final exhibit is an audio recording. It was made on a cellular phone by the petitioner's 13-year-old daughter, Wren Redmond, in the family kitchen. She recorded it without her parents' knowledge and sent it to her grandfather at midnight. With the court's permission," the speakers crackled, and then my son's voice filled the room again, rawer this time. Closer. Captured not by a camera hidden on a shelf, but by a child hiding a phone under a dishcloth. "I know this is wrong," Garrett said on the recording. "I know, but there's no way back now. We owe too much, and the only exit is through him." Then Jolene, "He shouldn't hear any of this. If that old man finds out before Friday, we lose the hearing and the house." My son's voice, my daughter-in-law's voice, my granddaughter's courage, all of it playing from the same recording. Fill a courtroom that had gone so quiet I could hear the flag outside the window snapping against its pole in the June wind. Boyd stopped the recording. He closed the laptop. The projector fan spun down and clicked off. "Your Honor," Boyd said quietly, "that recording was made by the petitioner's own daughter. She sent it to her grandfather because she wanted someone to do the right thing." He paused. "I believe we are doing it now." I gripped the armrest to keep from turning toward Garrett. My knuckles were white the same way his had been 20 minutes ago, before the evidence started and the world he'd built caved in around him. I did not look at my son. I couldn't. Not because I was angry. I was past angry, past grief. past every word I knew for what a father feels when his child tries to erase him. But because if I looked at him now, he would see my face, and I was not ready to show him what was on it. Judge Thornton picked up her pen. She began writing without looking up. Garrett sat alone at the petitioner's table, and the only sound in the courtroom was his exhale, long, hollow, the sound of air leaving a structure that had already collapsed from the inside. Judge Thornton set down her pen. She looked at Garrett the way a surgeon looks at a limb that cannot be saved, and reached for her gavel. This court finds the guardianship petition fraudulent from its inception, supported by forged military documents, purchased medical affidavits, and deliberate sabotage of the respondent's hearing devices. The petition is voided. Mr. Redmond's full legal autonomy is restored, effective immediately. The gavel struck once, a single crack that divided everything into before and after. This matter is referred to the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Montana for prosecution under federal statutes governing VA benefits fraud, forgery of military records, and elder abuse. Federal marshals waiting in the corridor have been authorized to take Mr. Garrett Redmond into custody pending arraignment. 2 U.S. Marshals moved toward the petitioner's table from both sides with the practiced calm of men who knew the quiet ones were easier than the loud ones. Garrett did not stand. He did not resist. He sat with his palms flat on the table, the same stillness I'd held for the past hour. The same posture I'd taught him before he was old enough to understand why a man sometimes needs to look like he's not moving while everything inside him burns. They lifted him by both arms. He rose like a man made of paper. "Dad," he said, not to me, not to anyone, just the word, released into the air the way you'd release a breath held too long. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Watching your own child be led away in restraints means understanding in the same terrible breath that you are both the reason he is there and the reason he should be. I raised him. I taught him the value of land and the weight of a promise. And somewhere in the years between the day I carried him into this family and the night he broke into my study to steal it, every lesson bent into something I didn't recognize. I swallowed the salt in my throat and kept my face still. Not because I was performing anymore, because if I let it move, I wasn't sure it would stop. Boyd touched my shoulder. I nodded. We stood. The hallway was marble and fluorescent light, and Jolene was already there pressed against the wall with her arms wrapped around herself, her tissue gone, her face stripped of every expression I'd ever seen her wear except fear. She saw me and dropped. Not to her knees, all the way down, folding onto the marble like someone had cut her strings. Her hands found my boots. The same boots I'd worn the day I carried her across our threshold because Garrett forgot it was tradition. Her fingers gripped the leather, and her voice came out in pieces. "Please, Harvey, you can stop this. You can tell them it was Garrett's idea. I didn't. I was just trying to help him." I looked down at her hands. I felt nothing I recognized as mercy. 3 months I'd let this woman turn my hearing aids into weapons, watched her rehearse grief at my kitchen table, listened to her whisper instructions about how to make me disappear faster. She had called me Dad exactly once the morning they loaded me into the van, and the word had carried the same warmth as a forged signature. "You lost that right," I said, "the night you turned my ears down so I couldn't hear my own granddaughter crying in the next room." I stepped past her. Her hands slid off my boots onto the marble, and the sound of her sobbing followed me down the hallway the way echoes follow you through a canyon, present, persistent, and impossible to answer. Wren was waiting by the courthouse doors. She stood with her backpack over one shoulder and her letter, the one she'd written at Boyd's office, the one that had sat on top of the evidence folder all night, folded in her hands. She looked up at me with eyes that held too much understanding for 13 years on this earth. "Can we go home now, Grandpa?" she asked. I took her hand. It was small and warm inside my calloused palm, and it fit there the way some things fit not because they were designed to, but because the space had been waiting. We walked through the courthouse doors into June sunlight that hit like a wall after hours of fluorescent purgatory. The air smelled like cut grass and tasted like the first honest breath I'd drawn in months. Behind us, Jolene's sobs echoed off marble. Ahead of us, Boyd was already on the phone because there was a ranch to take back, a conservation easement to sign, and a girl who needed a bedroom that wasn't a battlefield. The second time I walked into that courtroom, I wore my own clothes, sat where I chose, and carried nothing in my pocket except a photograph of Garrett at age 9, the year I became his father. The cardigan was gone. The performance was over. I was just a man in a room where his son was about to be sentenced. The hearing was brief. Federal sentencing proceedings rarely deliver the drama people expect. No gasps, no speeches, no last-minute revelations. Judge Thornton read the charges. She cited the evidence. She delivered the terms. I will not tell you how many years they gave my son. I'll only tell you it was enough to make a young man old, and enough to make an old man sit in a courtroom and wonder where he went wrong. Jolene received a lesser term for elder abuse and unauthorized tampering with a medical device, plus a permanent ban from any fiduciary or elder care role in Montana or any federal jurisdiction. She stood motionless when the sentence landed, her hands clasped in front of her, her face holding the careful blankness of a woman who had finally run out of performances to give. Neither of them spoke. The courtroom was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with silence and everything to do with absence. The absence of excuses, of arguments, of the elaborate machinery they'd built to take my life apart. All of it was gone now, dismantled by the same evidence they'd never believed I could gather. You want me to tell you I felt relief. I know you do. But relief is what you feel when a storm passes, not when you realize the storm was your own son. Garrett looked at me once as they let him out. Not the panicked glance of a man searching for rescue, and not the defiant stare of someone who still believed he was right. Just a look. Steady. Empty. Final. I held his gaze. I didn't nod. I didn't look away. I gave him the only thing I had left to give, the truth that I was still there, and that being there cost me everything. The courtroom door closed behind him. The sound was small, definitive, the kind of sound that doesn't echo because there's nothing left to bounce off. I hadn't eaten all day. The emptiness felt appropriate. Boyd met me in the hallway. He had a folder under his arm and the look of a man who understood that good news delivered on a day like this required careful handling. "Solar contract voided by the court," he said. "Garrett had no legal authority to execute it. Ranch title restored clean. Pension reinstated with 6 months of back payments deposited as of this morning. You're whole again, Harvey, at least on paper." "Paper," I said. "That's all any of it ever was, Boyd. Paper with numbers on it. The things that matter don't come with back payments." He nodded. He knew. 27 years of borrowed time had taught him the difference between what courts can restore and what they can't. "The conservation easement is ready," he said. "You can sign it today if you want." "I've been ready since March. Give me the pen." We walked to the parking lot. July heat rose off the asphalt in visible waves, and the smell of it, tar and dust, and the faint green edge of alfalfa drifting from somewhere beyond the city was the first thing that had felt real since morning. Boyd spread the easement across the hood of his truck. I signed it with a pen that clicked once under my thumb, pressing hard enough to feel the metal hood through the paper. 160 acres of Montana protected permanently. The land Garrett tried to leverage. The acreage the solar company wanted to cover in panels. The ground my father worked before me, all of it locked in conservation trust. Beyond the reach of debt or greed or any son who might come after. Boyd witnessed the signature. He didn't congratulate me. He folded the document, slid it into the folder, and said he'd file it in the morning. I drove home alone. The cottonwoods were full and green along Route 312. The same trees that had blurred past the van window when they took me away. The house was dark when I pulled up the gravel drive. Dark except for one window on the second floor, the small bedroom at the end of the hall that had been empty since Garrett moved out decades ago. Wren's light was on. Boyd had brought her home that morning. Taped to the front door was a drawing on lined notebook paper. 2 stick figures on a porch, one tall and one small, with the words, "Welcome home, Grandpa," written in purple marker. The tape pulled slightly as I peeled it free. I held it under the porch light and stood there longer than I should have, because some things deserve more time than efficiency allows. The first morning Wren woke up in the ranch house, I heard footsteps in the hallway at 6:15 a.m. And for 3 seconds, I thought it was Garrett. Age 11, padding to the kitchen for cereal before school, the footsteps were lighter, quicker. A girl's stride, not a boy's. But the hallway creaked in the same places, and the sound landed on something in my chest that I hadn't known was still alive. I gave her Garrett's old bedroom. She stood in the doorway and looked at the faded Air Force posters, squadron patches, a cockpit photo. A recruitment print from 1986 that had yellowed at the edges and said, "Grandpa, can I put my drawings up in here? Dad's old posters are kind of scary." "They're not scary, sweetheart, but they're his. Let's put them in a box we don't throw away. We just make room." We packed the posters carefully. I rolled each one and slid it into a cardboard tube while Wren held the tape. She didn't ask why I handled them so gently, and I didn't explain. Some lessons teach themselves if you let a child watch instead of telling her what to see. By the end of the first week, her purple marker drawings covered the walls where the posters had been. Horses, mountains, a stick figure man in a chair on a porch. The room smelled like crayons and fabric softener from a life before the ranch, and it sounded like a bedroom again instead of a museum. We built routines. Morning chores at 6:30, feeding the horses, checking the fence line along the creek, hauling water to the trough in the north pasture. She asked me to teach her to saddle up. I showed her the same way my father showed me, left hand on the withers, right hand on the cinch. Talk to the animal before you touch it. How do you teach a 13-year-old girl to love a place that tried to destroy her family? And how do you admit that the place isn't what did the destroying? Don't explain it. You hand her the reins and ride beside her until the land answers the question for you. Afternoons, we rode to the north pasture where the alfalfa ran to the tree line. Evenings, we sat on the porch with French press coffee for me and hot chocolate for her. And the silence between us wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence 2 people build when they're learning to trust the same air. "Grandpa," she said one evening, her boots propped on the railing, "do you think Dad thinks about us?" "Every single day, Wren. That I'm sure of." She nodded and went back to her sketchbook. I went back to my coffee and the Beartooth Range and the weight of a question I couldn't answer more honestly than that. Boyd's truck came up the gravel drive at the end of July. He brought the finalized conservation easement and a manila folder thick with something new. 160 acres protected in perpetuity, he said, spreading the document across the porch railing. No development, no solar farms, no strip mining. The land stays the way your father found it. I signed it with a cheap ballpoint from the hardened Dollar General, the same pen Boyd had used to file the counter motion. The most inexpensive pen in Montana, measured by its price. The most valuable, measured by what it protected. The conservation plan I'd invented as bait. A lie designed to flush out my son's panic had become the truth I chose to live. The land was safe now, permanently. Beyond the reach of any debtor scheme or desperate child who might come after. "One more thing," Boyd said. He opened the manila folder. "I want to use your case with your permission as the founding brief for a Veterans Elder Abuse Defense Fund. Legal representation for retired servicemen and women exploited by family members. Your precedent, your name if you want it on the letterhead." "Put it on there," I said, "and take whatever seed money you need from the contract savings. If this happened to me, 28 years of service, combat decorations. A ranch with my father's name on the deed. It's happening to men who have less and no Boyd Sinclair to call. Wren looked up from her sketchbook. What does perpetuity mean? Grandpa, it means forever, sweetheart. It means this land will be here when you're my age and your grandchildren are yours. That evening, she fell asleep on the porch swing with her boots still on, north pasture mud dried on the soles. I pulled a blanket over her and eased the sketchbook from her fingers. I sat down in the chair my father built in 1961 and watched the Beartooth Range turn pink in the last light. The ranch was quiet. The land was protected. And somewhere in a federal facility 400 miles south, my son was spending his first night in a cell, and I was spending mine in the chair where I'd once held him as a baby and promised I'd never let anything hurt him. People ask me how I knew how a 71-year-old man with sabotaged hearing aids and a son who wanted him declared incompetent managed to see it all coming. The answer isn't complicated, it's just old. My father taught me before the military ever did. He sat in the same chair on the same porch and watched the same Beartooth Range I'm watching now. And when I was 8 years old and asked him why he never yelled at the cattle buyers who tried to cheat him, he said, "You keep your face still, Harvey. You let them talk. You let them show you who they are. And when you know enough, you move not before." I carried that into the cockpit. I carried it through SEER school. I carried it through 28 years of military service and a marriage and a funeral and a son who forgot every word of it. And I carried it through the worst 3 months of my life, sitting in my own house pretending to be a man wasn't, because the people who were supposed to love me had decided I was worth more confused than clear. The hearing aid sat in my ear like it always had, small, quiet, invisible. But for the first time since March, it played the world the way the world actually sounded. Dr. Faye Holbrook in Laurel had reset it to factory specifications. No white noise, no phantom static, no manufactured confusion. Just the creek behind the barn running cold over limestone. The meadowlarks calling from the north pasture. And the scratch of Wren's pencil on notebook paper as she worked through a math problem with her boots propped on the porch rail. Mud still drying from morning chores. If you're still listening, and I hope you are, then you already know this isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about what you're willing to lose to keep the things that can't be replaced. I lost a son, not to death, to something worse, to the slow rot of debt and desperation and the terrible mathematics of a man who looked at his father's life and saw a number instead of a person. That loss is permanent. No court ruling restores it. No conservation easement fills the space where a boy used to stand in the kitchen doorway and ask what was for dinner. But I kept a granddaughter. I kept 160 acres of Montana that will be here long after every Redmond is dust. I kept the chair my father built, and the porch he swept, and the view he loved, and the lesson he taught me before I was old enough to know I'd need it. That's not a victory. That's a trade. And some mornings, when the light is right and Wren is beside me, I almost believe I got the better end of it. She laughed at something in her textbook, a sudden, bright sound that carried across the porch like a bell. I hadn't heard a child laugh in this house since Garrett was small enough to fit in my lap. That was over 3 decades ago. It sounded exactly the same. The same pitch, the same surprise, the same way it bounced off the porch roof and scattered the meadowlarks and made the morning feel like it was worth showing up for. I took a sip of coffee, French press, strong and black, from my own kitchen, the first cup I'd truly tasted in months, hot, bitter, perfect. The ceramic was warm in my hands, and the armrest of my father's chair was smooth under my palm. Worn down by 63 years of Redmond men sitting in the same spot and watching the same mountains and carrying things they couldn't name. If you're sitting where I sat, if someone you love is taking pieces of you so slowly you almost don't notice, I need you to hear this. Stillness is not weakness. Patience is not surrender. And the face you keep for the world is not a lie, it's a shield. Use it until you're ready. Then set it down. "Grandpa, can you hear the creak from here?" Wren asked, looking up from her homework. "I can now, sweetheart. I can hear everything now." She smiled and went back to her math. The pencil scratched. The creek ran. The morning light moved across 160 protected acres, and the Beartooth Range held still against a sky so clear it hurt to look at. "Grandpa," she said again. A minute later, "Are you okay?" I looked past her at the mountains, the same mountains my father watched from this chair, the same mountains I'd watched the night they took me away, the same mountains that hadn't moved an inch through any of it. I took a sip of coffee and kept my face still. Some habits you don't break. You just finally learn what they're for. And to you listening to my story, remember this. I spent 3 months pretending to be less than I was, letting my own son and his wife believe they were winning, swallowing every insult, every sabotaged hearing aid, every whispered plan I wasn't supposed to catch. If I could go back, I'd tell myself sooner that silence isn't the same as acceptance. Don't make my mistake of waiting until they nearly took everything before you trust your own instincts. This wasn't a revenge story in the way most people think of one. There were no explosions, no shouting matches, no dramatic confrontations in parking lots. The real revenge story was patience, the discipline to sit still, gather the truth, and let the people who wronged me build their own trap. I believe God put me through every one of those quiet, painful days for a reason, so that when the moment came, the truth would be strong enough to stand on its own without anger holding it up. The lesson isn't about getting even. It's about knowing that the people closest to you can be the most dangerous, and that stillness, real stillness, is the most powerful revenge story you'll ever live through. If this story hit close to home, if you've ever sat in a room where someone you raised or someone you loved decided you were worth more broken than whole, I want to hear from you. Tell me your story in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. Some details in this story were fictionalized for narrative purposes, but the heart of it, the lesson about trust, patience, and knowing when to move that part, is as real as it gets. God bless you all.